Our featured speaker is Brendan Light with Drew Seith as our moderator, both from Buzzback Market Research. Please feel free to ask questions throughout this webinar. We will reserve time at the end of the presentation to answer any of them. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during our Q&A portion. I want to also remind them that you can ask these questions by typing them into the Q&A part of the toolbar located on the bottom of your screen. This session will also be recorded and archived so that you can refer to it at any time after today's live seminar or send it to your colleagues who might not have been able to join us today. We'll be also sending you a link following this seminar where you can retrieve this archived file. Now about today's featured speaker. Brendan leads research development and best practices for Buzzback. In addition to continually improving the quality of the quantitative and qualitative methodologies and analytics of Buzzback's research offerings, he pioneered Buzzback's award-winning and patent-pending eCollage and verbatim viewer and leads the future development and research strategy for Buzzback. He continues to focus on leveraging the transformative powers of the Internet to evolve respondent engagement, operational efficiency, and visualization of analytics and insight. Brendan has over 15 years of client and research supplier-side experience, having also served as research director for Gray Interactive and as global director of IPSIS ASI Interactive. And with that said, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Brendan Light.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I certainly want to thank you for your time. I'll do my best to make sure you find it fully worthwhile as we progress through all of this. What we're going to do today is present some ways that you can uniquely learn some additional dimensions and nuances of words that are going to be important to your brand. As a very fundamental starting point, we could start by saying that brands have a brand platform that they try and build off of. And it doesn't have to be as core and essential as a brand platform. It can just be key brand attributes that you believe should be defining your brand. And be it a brand platform or an attribute, you want to make sure that everybody internally and externally is buying into that vision. And so it really is, how do you make sure that every point of contact with your brand reinforces that language? It is not simply the language that you will use to communicate to your consumers, but it is the brand and the product and the experience itself that every sense needs to be engaged with whatever that word is. So our goal is to show you some ways that we've developed that can help you to understand some of those complexities and help you understand some of the very unique considerations that you need to do when trying to embody your brand platform or your key brand attributes. Here is basically one very, very simple example. I've managed to pull this brand platform from a presentation that Mary Maids had filed with the SEC, being that not a whole lot of our clients were eager to share their brand platforms publicly. But very simple language here of trusted help. And then they're trying to break this down into multiple dimensions and visualize all of the supporting pieces that ladder up to eventually meaning trusted help. What we're trying to do today is show you how you can quickly and affordably fill in a lot of this information and define a lot of those dimensionalities using our tools that really are a hybrid of quantitative and qualitative techniques. So we're going to walk through, if time allows, all three, but certainly at least the first two of these. We're going to try and do three different keywords that could be a brand platform. We felt these were very interesting words to evaluate in this particular point in time due to the state of the economy and how these words might have new meaning for consumers, as being that we're in the middle of a recession, and trying to understand how they all kind of even play against one another. They're interesting in that they are somewhat interrelated. So the first one we're going to look at is luxury and what the word luxury means to people. I quickly grabbed a visual not quite a definition, but from the visualthesaurus.com, they provide a bunch of synonyms and, to help us try and understand the most literal interpretation of the word luxury. And it probably is the top of mind reaction a lot of people would have to the word luxury. And I imagine with each of the three words, you probably had very immediate reactions in terms of what you think those words mean. What we're going to show is it goes quite a bit beyond simply this very literal interpretation. We asked respondents in a study to give us both words that were similar to luxury and the opposite of luxury. And we did all of these studies we did both in the U.S. and the U.K. to try and understand what kind of nuances might be unique within those markets, but also just to demonstrate how quickly and easily this can be done in a global setting, distributing this technology across multiple markets. What's interesting to note on this slide is that respondents told us that, for the most part, luxury is in the eye of the beholder. With the high percentage numbers we're looking at, we would have expected verbal playback of what luxury means to be much more diverse than what we see here. An initial text reaction to the question of what words are similar or what words are opposite is pretty thinly defined and not very helpful. And in fact, it looks a whole lot like what the visual thesaurus would have told us. What we're trying to do is find ways to get beyond this. If luxury is truly in the eye of the beholder, how do we get at that subtle nuance of what the variable meanings are to different people? One of the tools we use to get at these types of questions is a proprietary tool that we've developed which allows for collaging online that we call eCollage. And in it, we have a basic question that we ask to respondents. And so for each of these words we simply ask people, create a collage that demonstrates to you what you think and feel when you think of the word blank. So for the first one, it's obviously luxury. And what we do is we provide images for people to create a visual collage for us. Now, these are not the specific images from this study. This is just an example of how the tool works. Just looking to show you how respondents can quickly and easily create a collage by dragging images onto the canvas. They can move images around as they would like. They can resize images. They can rotate them. They can affect layering. And so it really becomes a very personal expression visually of a topic. So we're first going to look at how people reacted to the word luxury. These were the actual images that we provided to people, which were fairly diverse. For every single project we do, we create a custom image set to provide to respondents, typically between 100 and 150 images that try to address a lot of different possible metaphor uses people may have in expressing a reaction to a question. We basically follow the Goatley model of universal metaphors, which says there's 13 general buckets of metaphors that people express themselves on. And so we just make sure people are able to express themselves on those. We try and make sure we have a good diversity of color opportunities available, a good diversity of people versus animals versus inanimate objects, indoor versus outdoor, active versus inactive, etc. Try and provide a lot of diversity and work with our clients to make sure we feel we have a very good set available to our respondents. So every respondent in both the U.S. and the U.K. had this exact image set to play with. This takes a giant leap away from traditional offline collaging in that now that I have a consistent image set, I can start to quantify this qualitative experience. That I know the percentage of people using and not using every picture and how you're used in combination and how they interact with other survey data as well. Out of all the pictures available, these were the top images that reflected the word luxury to people. So while the initial definition we looked at was very focused on money and things being expensive, etc., luxury already we can see is starting to take on a little more nuance than initially described. To have people help us understand what their collages mean, we always ask follow-up questions to help them decode their collage for us so we can understand it. And so what we do is we first looked at a lot of the images that were in common amongst the both the U.S. and the U.K. So for all respondents, what were most commonly used images that everyone used, and what was the language around why people were using those images? So now we're seeing that there's some new words, relaxing, special, and time, that are starting to add a little more complexity to our topic of luxury. We can also start to get to some interesting learning when we separate our different groups and look at what's unique amongst the American U.S. notion of luxury versus a UK version of luxury. And we are just starting to see some differences between those markets in terms of how they're viewing it. As I mentioned, we have follow-up questions where we ask people to describe their collages. And if you look at these words, we're starting to see some very, very different notions from our initial language that we looked at. We're already seeing a pretty significant broadening of what luxury means. So on the top here, we see the language that was used as follow-ups to collage, and the bottom is what we initially were looking at when we asked people for words similar to luxury. And I think it's pretty quick. You can see how in both the U.S. and the UK, we have broadened the notion of what luxury is by moving beyond a traditional text-based answer into one that leverages the eCollage technique. In addition to the findings of specific words and specific images that we use, we also like to look at the full picture, the actual collages people make. It's a very rich qualitative deliverable, both in terms of the picture and the open ends that people will provide in helping us to decode the images. We found consistently over time that open ends that accompany a collage project are roughly twice the quantity of words as a similar open end that was not preceded by a collage question. So we are getting at a much greater propensity to richness of information by priming people with this visual exercise. We see a lot of good diversity in terms of the types of pictures people are using, the types of composition that people do. It's a very intentional exercise. Respondents typically are spending between 5 and 15 minutes on creating their collage. Now, compare that voluntary amount of time with the general direction the industry is going in, trying to shorten and shorten and shorten surveys. And I would agree that the boring, painful, traditional survey should be shortened as much as possible. But when we're providing interesting, engaging, interactive applications such as eCollage, we are not so hampered by a time limit as we are with traditional surveys. Again, here's just another example of a collage somebody had given. These are available for all respondents, but obviously it makes a lot of sense if we can find ways to abbreviate them to find the most impactful ones, the same way we would do looking at trying to go through all of the open ends in a survey and find the ones that are most important to highlight. Next step we do beyond the qualitative analysis of understanding luxury is looking at a pretty advanced quantitative angle. And so we did factor analysis on these images to try and understand some of the unique dimensions that we see. And so with factor analysis, what we're trying to accomplish is distinguish some unique dimensions, some unique factors on which people are using images as a visual graphic lexicon. So the mere fact that we're actually able to successfully pull off a factor analysis really points to the fact that people are very intentional with their image selections. It is not a very arbitrary, random experience. People are meaningful in the images they use, even if we don't objectively know what that image usage is, and we have to decode that through follow-ups and through factor analysis. So for the words we're going to look at today, we focused on a 4-factor solution, and we'll show some of those factors. They vary in strength, as factor analysis always does. Some of these factors are more meaningful than others. Some are more clear than others. Unlike a lot of factor analysis, we have to infuse a bit more art into the science in that the pictures don't speak themselves to what the factor is, and we have to do quite a bit of interpretation on that. But I think you'll see it's fairly credible and supported. The first factor for luxury we found, and already we're taking a significant departure from the original notion of luxury being about a financial, expensive, rich, money-oriented angle. The first dimension that the pictures really brought to us was an enjoyment dimension of luxury, meaning being able to do the things that you want to do, whatever that is. It's the luxury to do it. And so both the words from the people scoring high on this dimension and the images really reinforce that notion. So how you basically look at this page is the images going left to right and then top to bottom show how they are incrementally contributing towards this dimension. The more towards the upper left the image is, the higher it is impacting on this and defining this dimension, and same with the opposite. The lower right images have the least contribution towards this factor. And then when we look at the word clouds here, the visuals, the bigger the word is, the more frequently respondents were using them. And the words in the upper left are showing among the top 20% of people scoring on this dimension versus the bottom right is the bottom 20% of people. And we're seeing a great diversity there in terms of the images and words that are helping us to define this dimension. The next dimension we found was very simply about travel. And it really stuck out to us as a very unique and self-defining dimension. And so the luxury of travel is very powerful, as unique from being necessarily just about money. It's just the opportunity to travel being very unique. The third dimension we found is probably the most typical and expected, and probably falls most in line with our original definition from when people were asked simply to use words that define it. So we have come back to that original definition, but now rather than being the only definition, it's one of 4 different dimensions of what luxury means to people. And so here we see the words and the images that really reflect that more opulent lifestyle as a definition of luxury. The fourth one is one of our weaker scoring dimensions, and so it's not one we would really emphasize, and it's really more about just simply the luxury of pampering, of being able to do things for yourself. And this one really wasn't driven so much by the language, but as the images. And again, this was one of our weaker dimensions. The other 3 were the strongest and most unique. What's important is, again, this is really reaffirming the intentional and unique usage of the images within Collage to communicate some very varied interpretations of the word luxury, but we also are able to now identify some pretty unique subgroups. We can go in and further investigate what amongst those people who score high on a particular dimension, what that dimension really means to them and how luxury fits into their life. And it allows us to do some pretty specific targeting that would not have been available to us had we relied on the more initial traditional interpretation of what luxury means. Beyond looking then at the collage, we also had respondents complete a thought bubble exercise. So it's very similar to thought bubbles that you might see in a focus group or an IDI. And we basically have ported this into the on-end environment. And rather than simply having people imagine a situation or fill in a traditional open-end question while looking at a picture, we actually have the respondents type their answers into the thought bubbles themselves. And this creates either a projector or enabling question type depending on what we're doing. And so we just ask people here to imagine that these, and so if it was a man, they saw the picture on the right. If it was a female respondent, they saw the picture on the left. And we just said, imagine this man or woman was describing something they've done recently that really embodied the word luxury. And so it's a way to get around very obvious traditional notions of how luxury fits into people's lives, and we start to understand the characteristics of luxury. And so these are just 2 quick examples of some of the interesting responses we got to a thought bubble question. We found it at the very least in any given project, it's a more engaging and interesting way for people to participate in studies, but when done correctly, it really does provide insights that go far beyond traditional open ends to whatever your subject matter is. We then asked people to describe some particular items and senses that may be associated with luxury. And the important thing to note here is that the collage is a very powerful priming technique in terms of opening up people's thinking to questions about products. And we have found traditionally that there is a significant difference in the types of language people use. And so we found it very interesting to see what kind of words people would use when we look at these different subject categories. So we asked people to describe what would be some foods and drinks that would embody luxury. What would be some smells? And what's very interesting here, and we find this across the board, is there's quite a bit of consistency between both the U.S. and the U.K. in terms of how they answer these. One thing that was very interesting on the food and drinks was just how French-centric the major words really were. That was very, very specific for both markets, that it was champagne and caviar and chocolate and wine. It was much more typical of a French palate than a traditional British or American. The smells of luxury were very interesting in terms of perfume being a very, very strong word in both markets. But there's, again, consistency here between words like chocolate and leather and flowers, and surprisingly, fresh being a very strong word. We also asked people to describe sounds that would embody the word luxury. And again, we see a lot of consistency between the markets for both the U.S. and the U.K. And very interesting, music is a powerful sound that we found with all of the words that we used. Other major ones here we found across both the markets were ocean or waves or the sea, surprisingly being very strong for both markets. And the feel of luxury really seems to come down to silk. That is clearly for both markets the major word that people are using to describe the feel of luxury. We also asked people to describe the destinations that most embody luxury to them. And here we actually see our first departure between our two different markets, that the UK has the highlight on Dubai, Maldives, Bahamas, and Caribbean, where the US is much more focused on Paris and Hawaii and the Bahamas. And it's very interesting to note here that Paris, being a luxury destination for the US, is a much less so luxury destination in the UK. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with the amount of time it takes to travel and the cost of travel there. But what it really speaks to is there's more to a luxury destination than the destination itself. It is the effort and the resources required to get there, that it is the opportunity to go as much as it is the money to go. And so that's very interesting finding in terms of the differences, that we find it's less about the objective properties of the town than it is the resources required. So I mentioned earlier, we ask a lot of open-ends and get a lot of extra language than is typically afforded from open-ended questions. We needed to come up with a way for us to be able to navigate all of the amount of text we have, to be able to find the learning. I believe in the power of coding for open-ends in terms of being a way to summarize results, but to rely on them is really to miss out on a big opportunity of really understanding what's going on in your verbatim responses. I would argue for people that simply rely on coding to skip the open-ends altogether and just go in with pre-coded lists, that the value of open-ends is from the actual little answers. But that's a lot of work to read through them. So as you've been seeing with the word cloud that we've been showing that highlight the frequency of usage of words, our tool here allows us within a given question. So right now I'm looking at the eCollage follow-up question in terms of people explaining what luxury means to them. And I can go through and filter in on people using specific words. So if I want to find out for those people, the 81 responses that focused on relaxing as being part of luxury, I can now go in and find all of those people and understand the role of relaxing. Traditional coding would have just had relaxing be part of it. Now I have the ability to very quickly go through and find all of those quotes And I can do it for multiple words. I can do it for relaxing and family. Now I can look at the 10 people who used relaxing and family and how their open-ended responses go, and I can then differentiate that from people who are using relaxing and travel, and there's 13 people who are using relaxing in that context. The context of understanding those words in the open ends is very important, and that's something that you just simply don't get by relying on coding alone. We're able to do this very quickly and easily for all of the questions that are open-ended in a survey, and allows us to go in and find out the context that people have for all of these. So what we like to do when we're trying to investigate these words is try and pull together as much of this information as we can. And even because we're on a compact schedule today, we're only showing some of the questions we actually asked. And there were far more that we asked, including, if you can see at the bottom, we asked people what color most embodies the word luxury. So we pull this all together, and we're able then to start to create a picture in terms of what luxury is. And where we moved away from the ingoing assumption of luxury being about money and expensive and rich, to really understanding that luxury is a much broader notion that focuses more on opportunity than it does on anything specifically money-oriented. So keeping your notion broader at the idea of opportunity will better help you to embody luxury to people. So again, here on the left, we see the top images that were used in the collage. On the right, we see them separated by market. It's a nice little cheat sheet that we can provide to help understand the meaning of your specific words. The next one we're going to look at is a word very similar to luxury, yet does have its own unique characteristics. Now, I'd urge you to be thinking to yourself, how would you differentiate indulgence from luxury, if at all? Because we actually found some pretty significant differences. Certainly when we ask for words that are similar to indulgence, luxury does play a pretty strong part. But again, we know from looking at the last slide, this is probably an overly narrow interpretation of the word. And so how do we try and get at the more broad interpretation of the word indulgence? We did the eCollage again for this project. We used a lot of the similar images from luxury, a little bit more broad set here as well. And from this entire set, covering all of these different topic areas, these were the top images. Already we have a very strong direction in terms of what is unique about indulgence. The role of food in indulgence is very powerful. The top images used by all respondents in common across both of our US and UK markets were all food-oriented. And for the most part, they tended to be decadent foods rather than overeating in healthy food. People simply don't feel it's indulgent to eat too much asparagus. It typically is the less healthy food that people find to be indulgent. We do start to see a split again in terms of indulgence when we look at the distinct markets. The UK was interesting in terms of it was the first place, even between luxury and indulgence, that this specific little pocket was where we first start to see any objective negative attribution to the word. Luxury was not found to be in and of itself any kind of a dirty word, even in our bad economy. And the same with indulgence. It's not necessarily a dirty word, but where we start to see any kind of negative attribution is in the UK market here. But it was not an overpowering attribute that we found throughout. These are the most heavily used words in the follow-up to the collage questions on indulgence. Again, we already see the very powerful role of food coming in at this point. Compare that with how people initially had treated the word indulgent. It's very, very different. We're getting a very different interpretation by having the visual prompting for people to think about their subject matter. And we find this time after time in terms of respondents, after engaging in a collaging exercise, have a much deeper and more personal reaction to whatever it is that you're asking about. Here's a very detailed collage from somebody who is talking about their collage. Again, very food-oriented. And our ability to do these at a quantitative scale allows us to look at collages amongst subgroups such as based on gender, age, market, or any other question, and really start to understand how their collages are different by our traditional subgroups, as well as the subgroups we've shown we've been able to create through the factor analysis. I think it's pretty clear respondents are very verbose in terms of helping us to understand what their collages mean. It's really great in terms of getting us that language that helps us to understand what words like indulgence mean. There's a lot of documentation out there really showing how people tend to think and communicate very heavily through the use of metaphor. And collage is a fabulous tool for that in terms of constantly reinforcing the metaphors that people think in and having people express and decode those metaphors for us. When we looked at the factor analysis for indulgence, the first one we found was clearly just about food. Indulgence is so incredibly uniquely about food, and luxury at no point did luxury really have that. So even as intertwined as the words luxury and indulgence are, food really belongs to indulgence. Another angle that we found was about indulgent pampering, and here pampering was a stronger factor in indulgence than we saw it in luxury. And it really is about just doing the little things to take care of yourself. And relaxation and relaxing and nothingness, indulging in nothingness, is a really interesting angle that starts to come about. Just the notion of owning your own time was a theme that we saw throughout as being very important. Speaking of the importance of time, we found an entire factor devoted that seemed just to be about able to use time towards whatever you define as being productive. And it could be doing nothing, or it could be spending it with family and friends. It's really just having the opportunity to use time how you want and in whatever amount that you want. And what's really great about the factor analysis in this collage is this is such an incredibly distinct dimension than what we saw earlier being so heavily about food, that even though food plays such a strong role in defining indulgence to people, we are actually able to tap into additional definitions that people think of when they internalize words like indulgence. Here's where we probably have what would be the most initial gut reaction to the word indulgence, which is a more sinful, sensual, maybe morally questionable notion of indulging in activities. And it's only one of the four factors that we saw. So while, yes, the traditional stereotypical notion of indulgence does show itself through the collaging, it's only one of the four factors we saw. Again, we're highlighting a couple of the interesting thought bubbles that people had filled in for us in terms of what indulgence meant to them and to describe in a situation that was indulgent for them. Interestingly enough, both of these respondents, as with most of the respondents we saw, really focused again on food as being part of their personal indulgence. Similar with luxury, we had people describe some different words for smells that would communicate indulgence. Chocolate, incredibly powerful. And in fact, all of the powerful words around smells other than perfume were all food-oriented for indulgence. With sounds, it's very similar. And I found it to be very interesting that both indulgence and luxury shared not only an overabundance of music as a key word, but again the notion of ocean, waves, and the sea. For both luxury and indulgence, those are very powerful. And another one on a slightly smaller scale was birds. Birds showed up quite a bit in both of these cells as well. So some pretty unique things that I certainly never would have thought of going in as being common, important words. Another one that's obviously not nearly as powerful as music in here, but is just as much interesting to me, is the notion of silence or relaxing, the nothingness. Being able to indulge in nothingness is a powerful thing for people. Again, pulling together the key findings here, the major summary slides. What we found in Indulgence, obviously, as I've been making the point, it really is about food, and that's a truly unique characteristic that's different from luxury. One extra step we took in both of these cells is to have people define the difference between luxury and indulgence. So the people who were in the luxury cell were asked this question, and the people in the indulgence cell were asked it. And there were a few themes that pretty strongly played out. One of the most interesting ones in terms of language is the notion that luxury was routinely seen to be a noun, as a word, as a thing, where indulgence is a verb. It's the act of being indulgent. And so it is a very, very distinct thing in people's mind. And luxury often manifested itself for people as being something done that is beyond what is necessary. It is a special treat going above and beyond your normal usage set, whatever it is. So if you are on a lower income, a luxury could just be a $20 versus a $10 bottle of wine, and that's a luxury. Versus at the high end of an income scale, buying yourself a jet rather than buying an airplane ticket could be a luxury. Indulgence had a very different characteristic in terms of indulgence was more about quantity than it was about going outside of your normal set. So indulgence was often about overdoing it in terms of whatever it is you're doing. And again, that's the verb part about it. It's the action of consuming more than is necessary. But it could be things that you do every day. So we'll quickly go through the third case study. I'm going to go through really quick to make sure we have some time for questions. And the last word we covered was quality. And quality, again, people felt that it's, for the most part, in the eye of the beholder, and yet an incredible amount of consistency. And what I found to be really interesting with this is just asking people words similar to the word quality and how quickly people defaulted to the definition of quality being around the quality of a product or a service and not the many other ways that quality can come into your life. We had people do a collage using this unique image set, and we were able to really quickly get at those other definitions of what quality means. Here we see what the top images were amongst all respondents on quality. And for the most part, I think you look at these and you quickly see it has nothing to do with products in general. When we look at what those top images are and what they mean to people, we again find they have not so much to do with quality products. And actually it has to do more with quality relationships and quality time for people. There is a strong distinction between the U.S. and the U.K. when it comes to images around the word quality. I think even just looking at the 4 images here that are unique to these markets, you get a very good picture qualitatively, but it plays out consistently of the differences between these markets. American-made is a very important sign of quality still in the U.S. It's somewhat important amongst the UK audience, but it played out at a much lower level at around 20% for people in terms of being a heavy important factor for people. So if we look now at the words that people used to describe their collages and how quality plays a role, we see some very different words from what we looked at initially, where it was around value and excellence and expensive and basically, again, product descriptions related to quality. We're seeing other words as a result of the collage: family, life, time. Now we can start to look at some of the specific collages from respondents, and we start to see how they're describing quality in those other notions beyond simply quality products. Again, very lengthy descriptions. We simply do not see this length of an open-end coming from traditional open-ended questions. So we did the factor analysis on this group as well. The first dimension that we really saw was about quality of life coming from relationships with family and friends. So this is not about quality having to do with things and money. This is really about quality of life. The next one we saw was quality that came about through pampering luxury. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, these words, they do all seem to interrelate in certain ways, but as we're also saying, they have their very unique properties. Quality here, we saw people talking about how simply being able to take care of themselves and pampering themselves brings about a quality of luxury. Starting to get into one of the slightly weaker areas on describing quality was about a quality of a healthy and balanced life. But we did see a very distinct factor here from people talking about that. The healthy and the balanced life goes beyond simply the person, but also it does involve nature. It's a healthy and balanced ecosystem means for quality life. The last factor, which is not a super strong factor, but I found very interesting and very specific, was around hands. The visualization of hands is very, very important. And even you may have noticed it when we pointed out the top image selections overall. Out of all 150 images provided, that I believe it was 3 or 4 of the top 8 shown were all showing hands. That is a much stronger feature among the U.S. and the UK. It played out significantly higher in the US group. And it also has multiple interpretations. It doesn't mean simply one thing. It seemed to represent craftsmanship being hand-built. It seemed to represent a level of a quality relationship in terms of trusting a business provider. And it seemed to also represent closeness in relationships and quality relationships with people. So that one image of hands connecting and showing hands has a very, very multi-definitional meaning when it comes to quality. I found that to be very interesting. We asked people then also provide us thought bubbles on quality. It's very interesting diversity that we're getting from there. We asked people to provide words describing when you think about beauty products and quality, what comes to mind? When you think about household cleaners and quality. What is interesting in these is the split between people who defaulted to mentioning a brand name versus an attribute, because they weren't prompted to go with one or the other. But I found, looking across all the answers, people were pretty specific. When they got in one mindset, all of these categories we asked about, if they were using a brand, they mentioned a brand for everything. If they were using a brand attribute for one, they used a brand attribute for everything. And our ability then to go in and identify those people in different ways allows us to get at subgroups in a very unique way in terms of how people are internalizing these product categories. Found it very interesting just how incredibly powerful Sony owned the category for electronics. That when it comes to quality and electronics, there's one word, and it's a brand name, and it's Sony. Reliable, obviously, is showing up a bit there, but just does not compare. When it comes to cars, we see a slight shift away from a dominance by a brand name, reliable being very important. Reliability and durability are definitely the major hallmarks of quality that played out across categories, across collages, across everything. When you're talking about products, reliability and durability are key. We asked about a couple of other product categories. Breakfast cereals. In the UK, clearly one word comes to mind, Kellogg's. In the U.S., there's a bit more diversity, and certainly General Mills has a stronger play in the U.S., but Kellogg still has a pretty strong association with the word quality. So if you compare that with the candy and the gum category, where taste is clearly the major word associated with that category, this kind of an exercise really allows us to understand which categories have white space with these words and which are dominated by brands already that own those words. It's a very interesting way to be able to see what the opportunities are in various markets. We also asked people to describe a quality item that they own. What is the highest quality item that you currently own? And the words that came back really spoke to us less about that whole notion of durability and reliability and more about a quality of experience. Computers do not typically have the strongest reputation amongst all of the categories that you can see on the screen of being the highest quality, longest working products, and yet in a very, very high quality item. Same with televisions and phones and laptops. There's a lot of the experience coming now into the notion of quality. Once you own a product, it's, yes, the durability and reliability is important, but a quality experience goes a long way towards reinforcing the notion that a product is of high quality. So for our summary on quality, we see that the major thing is yet quality products are simply durable, reliable, and effective. Those are the major components that people were routinely communicating to us. But we found that when we broaden the notion through collaging of what quality means, quality is more about the quality of life. And quality of life is defined by different ways for different people. You can quickly see here a brief summary of the most important words that we found for the various categories. And again, on the bottom, the color, we didn't go into depth there. We asked people the color that was most significant for it. And for quality, it was clearly a dark blue was the dominant color. So that's it for today. I'd welcome any questions you may have on this, and I hope you found it to be informative.
Great, thanks, Brendan. So there were quite a few questions, and for those of you that have questions that haven't entered them yet, feel free to enter your questions into the sidebar on the right, and we'll do our best to answer them now, and if we run out of time, we'll be happy to follow up with you individually after the fact. So, Brendan, the first set of questions are around when you do collaging, where do these set of images come from?
We have internally at BuzzBack, we have a library of thousands of images across multiple categories, and we source those from stock image houses where there are millions more that are available to us. And so if we don't have them in-house, we have the ability to go out and get additional ones. And we work with clients to find the right set. And there'll never be the perfect image set or a conclusive image set. We just try and make sure we're as broadly representative as we possibly can be. And I more or less liken it to picking the attributes you want to use when you're asking in a survey to people to respond to your brand attributes. Now, in a typical study, you might ask anywhere from 10 to 25 brand attributes and feel that that is conclusive for your needs. And we're providing 150 different images, far beyond the number of attributes. And even those images can have multiple definitions as well that we find we get from respondents. So while it's not nearly as conclusive as a finite set would be, it is pretty broad, and when we always find respondents are able to communicate pretty diverse thoughts using the pictures. And we typically will also ask people if there was a picture you hoped you could have used but wasn't there, could you tell us what that is? And so we don't get a whole lot of answers on that. Once in a while something comes in and something we consider for future projects.
And follow-up to that, how long does it usually take to get the set of images determined with a client? In other words, does that add a lot of time to the overall project?
It really doesn't. The addition of the entire exercise is basically negligible in terms of completing a project. We are pretty skilled at this point in creating a draft set to get to the client. The delays typically come from the client side, spending time thinking about how happy they are with an image set. Sometimes it takes them 5 minutes, sometimes it takes them a day or two to get comments back, and we finalize it. But we can certainly, within an hour or so, come up with a suggested initial set and work very quickly from there.
So there are a number of questions around sample size, a number of different dimensions of that. So let's start with, what is the typical sample size that BuzzBack would look to work with in studies of this type?
I would say that I would not look to have any unique considerations because of the collage exercise. We recommend robust, good quantitative sample sizes for all of our work when we can. If it's a more qualitative project and we simply can't do that, we will accommodate. But the more you have, the more opportunity you have. So we like to look at 150 to 200 respondents per cell. For these case studies I just went through, we had about 400 people per market per word in monadic cells that went through. You can certainly get a lot of good qualitative value out of doing as few as 25 people going through Collage, and we've done that and seen that, and it can be very, very powerful. Looking at both the total collages and the unique elements going in them, and certainly the follow-ups. But the higher your sample size, the better your quantitative data is going to be.
And what about for the factor analysis? There was a question on what size you felt you needed to get to be able to do the factor analysis. Does that have any special implications for you?
For the most part, we've been the issue it seems to be less about a specific sample size, but finding, do we really feel that a particular factor is strong at defining a unique dimension? So we like to look at least 150 people when we're doing the factor analysis. We don't have to go that high, but it's where we feel comfortable. But when we start to feel uneasy or good about the results, it's typically less driven by the sample size and more by just an assessment of the images that are showing for that factor and the language showing around the top end and the bottom end of that factor. Do we think it's a meaningful, actionable dimension? Is it something that a client can actually use? And you can feel bad about a factor with a high sample size, or you can feel good about a factor with a low sample size.
So speaking about time, typically how long does it take to do a full analysis, and how does that compare to the overall time that it takes from start to finish for a project like this?
So just a basic collage analysis, and basic meaning not advanced analytics, or something like a factor analysis, that kind of a project is typically going to be 3 weeks start to finish. There's obviously little things that can come up along the way from client requirements that can stretch that out a bit, but roughly 3 weeks. If you start adding in some analytics like a factor analysis, you're probably adding about a week to do a good job at it, to run through it, digest it, internalize it, analyze it, and make sense out of it for a client.
How about types of respondents? Have you seen any differences with different classes of respondents, whether it's seniors versus teens versus different ethnic groups versus different demographic kinds of groups, and their ability to participate?
Yeah, not really. For the most part, and we have certainly done this across all those different types of user groups, and we never really had any kind of an issue based off of a data point like that in terms of differentiating who makes for good collages and who doesn't. It typically is more about the subject matter that will make for a good or a bad collaging project. Because you could even have B2B product that benefits from the exercise. The key is to really focus your question in on more emotional and latent types of feelings people may have with a product, and that may not be specific to the product itself, but what problem is a product solving. So your ability to tap into that, to tap into experience and history and memories, all go a long way. Doing a collage on a low interest category in which people have no experience in it is just setting yourself up for very confusing results.
What about different geographies, both in the dimension of time, how much time does it take, and using different kinds of, or not different kinds, but different languages? How does that impact image selection, and how does it impact the overall survey design?
Well, I'd like to dispel the rumors that the British are very slow on the collaging. I hear that over. No. There's no difference whatsoever when it comes to one market being able to do it or not. We find there's very consistent usability between markets. We have custom language instructions and help text if it goes beyond doing it in English. So as an exercise, there is a real universality to the usability. It just is very similar to a lot of other online applications that people are already doing in their free time online. Where there does need to be some consideration is in the image selection. That in the image selection, there are going to be some images that are just more culturally loaded in one market to another. And that requires sensitivity and work on our part and our client's part to make sure that we're accounting for those loaded images. And so sometimes it means we're going to use a consistent image set across markets, and sometimes it means we're going to have a distinct image set as we move from one area to another. As we know, some pictures are simply going to be more or less important or more or less volatile.
And how long do people spend on average creating their collage?
We find that it runs between 5 and 15 minutes. Some people are pretty quick in terms of just getting their choices down and moving on to where they're really describing it, and we find some very minimalistic collages have incredibly thoughtful follow-ups that are very detailed. For the 4 or 5 images on their collage, there is a small novella of text helping us to understand, and it can be very powerful. Some people are very, very specific and considerate in composing a visual masterpiece and will pay attention to composition and sizing and balance on their collaging and spend up to 15 minutes making sure they get it just right, and be equally effusive in their follow-up open ends. It really depends. It is time intensive such that I wouldn't want to run 4 or 5 collages in a single project and risk people simply not having time to finish. But we don't have the abandonment problem with collages of people getting frustrated or bored or burnt out.
How about this question? Have you ever used these kinds of exercises on existing consumer products or brands versus broad topic areas?
Yes, and it takes a variety of uses. Collaging really is simply a question type, just as an open-end is a question type, just as a single punch question is a question type, and it all comes down to implementation in terms of the kind of value you can get from it. So for an existing brand, we can do collages on what's your earliest memory with this brand. We can do it, what's your biggest frustration with this brand. We can do just how do you feel about this brand. We could do do a collage of how this brand compares to another brand, and on the canvas set up anchors for brand A and brand B, and have people compare and contrast the brands. It can be what what brands are most similar to this brand, and rather than the kinds of images we've seen so far, we would take logos from completely different categories and find how people would react to a brand and try and get at imagery that way, try and find out how to extend a brand, using collaging to try and figure out where a brand can go beyond where it's at right now. You know, if you were to say, take Microsoft and do a collage about microwaves, and just try and figure out what your opportunities are, which directions can you stretch a brand. It's very powerful in a lot of ways.
Next question, would you see this technique as an adjunct or substitute for qualitative research, which I guess is intended to mean like focus groups? What do you see as the advantages over qualitative?
Well, I like to be very specific, and I'm going to make the assumption that by this we mean focus groups when we speak of qualitative, because I think this is actually as qualitative as a focus group is, if you look simply at the collages people make. As far as being in replacement of or in addition to, I think it kind of depends on your objectives. People like Zaltman doing the ZMET technique will tend to use a collage as a starting point and go incredibly deep in terms of laddering what the meaning of collages mean, and go much further than we will in a typical project. I can see the coupling of those approaches as being very powerful, whereas Altman would be able to get you the depth amongst a handful of people, and we would be able to get you the breadth across markets and high sample sizes. A lot of times I can see it as a replacement, though, in terms of the typical collage exercise in a focus group does not tend to get nearly as in-depth as Altman would. Ends up being a lot of time for cutting and pasting and gluing. Has a lot of inconsistency that once a picture is cut and glued to a board, nobody else can use it, and sometimes people bring in their own pictures, which means you get some insight into very specific people, but lack of any kind of consistency, lack of any ability to summarize at a group level. And our approach, by having that consistency, moves from a purely qualitative to also being a quantitative exercise. So I find it to be very powerful. Collaging in and of itself is not the end game. It is a priming technique to get people to talk about something. It can be used good or bad either in a focus group or in our online environment. Challenge is using it as an effective way to get people to be more thoughtful with wherever you're going after that.
So, Brendan, two more questions, and since we are over time a little bit, but we'll ask two more questions. The first one is on image meaning. There were a number of questions around how did you know, in the session you talked about the overweight person in the water and the Statue of Liberty, and so forth. How did you know? How did you come up with the conclusion of what the different images meant?
It's both direct and inferred. So if you saw in a lot of, if you're able to read through some of the very lengthy open ends that accompanied the collage images, there were people who were being very explicit in telling us what the images mean. And so we read through all of those and find out what the associations are with the images. And then it's also through the factor analysis, we will see very obvious themes by grouped images that will make it just so incredibly likely that a plane, a passport, a Statue of Liberty, a bag of luggage, these things probably are all speaking about travel. It's highly unlikely they're not speaking about travel. So it's an educated inference at that point. So we use both the direct and the inference.
Great. And the last question is on cost. Can you give a sense of what the cost would be for this kind of project?
For the projects if looking at just what we specifically ran through in these case studies, you're probably looking at a range, and it's going to depend on the sample size that you would run with. For the purposes of this, we were at a pretty high level, but more traditional sample project sizes, you're probably looking in the range of about 34,000 to 49,000, something in that range.
Okay, great.
Looks like we're out of time. I want to again thank Brendan Light and Drew Seif with Buzzback Market Research and everyone joining us on the call today. We hope you enjoyed our web seminar. We'll be sending you a link to the archive version shortly. If you have any further questions, feel free to send an email to Drew Seif at drew@buzzback.com. Again, thank you all for your time.
Thanks.